I hope you've had a chance to connect with your feedback partner. And as we get closer to week 2 and the due date of your first speech, it's important to talk a little bit about how we're going to critique that assignment, as well as how to be an effective listener. Because in order to give good feedback, we have to listen well. So, it can be hard to be a good listener all of the time. I'm sure we all know that. And to underscore that point, I came across an interesting story to share. And it starts in a college classroom, an environment that we're all normally in right about now. A psychology professor, actually, he wanted to know why his lectures really weren't hitting with students. He worked really long and hard to make them interesting, but it never seemed to work. He would look out at the students and their faces would have these bored looks and their eyes would be glazed over. Occasionally, someone would even be nodding off in the back. So he wanted to know, well, if they're not listening to me, what is on their minds? He decided to figure it out by doing an experiment. He goes into class one day, just like normal, and gets into his lecture. About 15 minutes or so in, reaches into his pocket, and he pulls out a gun and fires a blank. Now, I'm not sure how he got away with this. I think it happened many, many years, probably a few decades ago. When the students had calmed down, he asked them to take out a piece of paper and then record the thought that had been on their minds the moment before they heard the shot. He collected their responses, and this is what he learned. 20% of the students said that they were reminiscing about something, but they couldn't remember what. Another 20% said that they were worrying about something or thinking about lunch. 8% reported to be thinking about religion. 20%, oddly enough, admitted that at the time they were having sexual fantasies. And the final 20% were reportedly listening to the instructor. But of that 20%, only 12% were actually able to recall the subject of the lecture. 12%, that's a pretty low number. And you may have an audience that's very similar with any number of those thoughts on their minds, in addition to countless more. So it's important to talk about barriers to listening, what we can do as listeners to overcome those, more importantly though, as speakers to help those people out. So first, listening versus hearing. They are different. Hearing is a continuous process. We're always hearing noises that surround us. It's natural, but it is indeed passive. We're not really analyzing the lawnmower in the background or the background noise in our homes. In one ear, out the other. Whereas listening is active. It is a learned skill, so it's something you can get better at. And it's an active process, so you have to choose when to pay attention. And of course, throughout the day, we only do this intermittently or off and on. We choose when to focus and when to participate. There are 3 steps to quickly highlight in the listening process. First, concentrate. So picking out a message, singling something out from several other competing messages, including our internal thoughts, which is harder sometimes than other times. And then we focus on it. Once we then focused on that message, it's important to interpret it. And we do this by assigning meaning to that data. We filter it through our mental framework called a schema that is built of preconceived ideas that we've gathered from our backgrounds, our families, our education. It's an information shortcut processing system. And then we respond. There are many types of responses, everything from a vocal follow-up question to making a mental note, hey, I want to remember this information. It's actually going to be pretty useful. We know, though, listening is hard because there are multiple barriers. We'll go over 4. First is physiological. We've got the little image of the stomach there because physiological distractions have to do with our bodies. So it could be anything from hunger to sickness to lack of sleep that makes it hard to be a good listener. Next is psychological. So those are our internal thoughts, concentrating on things other than the speech. That could be anything from our weekend plans to a fight we had at home to a homework assignment that we have due in another class. So it's important to recognize when that's happening, as a listener and turn off all of those competing thoughts. And speakers help to avoid triggering distractions that can do sometimes with your attire, what you might be wearing, to certain terms that you might use. Next up, we have factual distractions. And I like to think of this as suffering from information overload, which you probably experience quite often. Think about the rise of 24/7 news and social media, and you put those together, and we have constant flood of information coming our way, updates to updates, and then we can lack a criteria by which we weigh that information and decide what is more important to listen to, what's worthy of our time. Well, the same thing can happen in a speech, where the speaker just floods us with facts. We as listeners get overwhelmed, and then we tune out. And that's one of the last things you want to have happen to your audience members if you're a speaker. So, speakers, primarily the burden lies with you when it comes to avoiding this distraction. First, think balance. There's a rule called 30-70, which says 30% of the information in your speech should be new data for your listeners. The rest, 70%, should be supporting that new, different ways of explaining and backing up what you've introduced. This also ties in with variety. It's important to stagger your speech and have a variety of supporting information, not just fact after stat after stat. That gets incredibly hard to listen to and absorb. So break those things up. If you have a fact in one part of your speech, back that up with an interesting quote that helps to illustrate that fact. Maybe then you have a statistic. Follow that up with a short anecdote that helps to reinforce the info in the stat that you just shared. So balance and variety. Finally, we have semantic distractions, and that's confusion over the meaning of words. So, speakers, you have to help us out with this too. Audience analysis is a huge factor in this, so you have to think about what terms your audience members are likely going to know or be familiar with. If you use a word you aren't sure they're going to know, just be safe and either provide a definition, a backup for explaining its meaning, or use another term that you're pretty sure that they're going to know. Avoid jargon or slang that you think is unfamiliar, or if you feel like you have to use those words, again, always explain what they mean. Before we move on to how to critique, I quickly want to reinforce the fact that we listen not just with our ears, but really more so with our eyes. 70 to 90% of all communication is nonverbal, and there's a great instance from history that illustrates that point. In 1960, we had the first presidential debate that was televised between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. So this is a pretty big deal. Researchers weren't sure what this new medium, its effect would be on the voting public, so they decided to develop an experiment. They took two groups of people and they put them in separate rooms. One group watched the debate on television, and at the end they were asked questions about who seemed more confident, presidential, likable, and who ultimately won. The other group, they only had a radio to listen to, so just the arguments, the substance itself, in addition to, some vocal variety and pausing. The television viewers overwhelmingly focused on nonverbals and appearance. They looked at Kennedy, who was much younger, more attractive, his family was very well known, and they saw him as presenting positive nonverbals, smiling, having open and up arm gestures, and often looking around. And he knew how he wanted to disseminate his image to the public. He was ready for the hot TV lights that often wash you out, so he had his makeup done, his hair perfectly put into place. Whereas Nixon, he was not so much prepared for that. An older guy to begin with, he was sick that day, and so was more washed out. He didn't have his makeup done, so he ended up looking a little sweaty. Viewers perceived that to be nervousness, and maybe he wasn't prepared for the role. A lot, though, one thing they pointed out the most was his shifty eyes, Nixon's shifty eyes. And typically in our culture, when we say someone has shifty eyes, it means they have something to hide. We shouldn't believe them. So overwhelmingly, the viewers in the TV group said that Kennedy won that debate. Turn to the other group with the radio. That group of respondents overwhelmingly said that Nixon had won. So you can see how powerful nonverbals are, and you should be mindful of them as you practice going forward for the first speech. Think about your facial expressions, your gestures, your posture, and of course your eye contact, because nobody wants to be a Nixon. Critiquing speeches. So the model I'm going to give you for the first speech is rather informal. You're going to watch your partner's presentation and take notes and send them through Canvas. You have much more formal assignments going forward from there, but this is just to get us started. The model you'll use is called the sandwich principle. It's often employed in a lot of corporate settings, so you may find this useful after this class. It's called the sandwich principle because it's shaped like a sandwich. Your first piece of bread over here on the left is a positive comment. You want to start by stressing something the speaker did well so that they will listen to the critique. They don't put their defenses up and then shut down. Then in the middle, that's where you can put the things that they need to work on. So areas of weakness, and then offer them some tips on how to improve. You can also put more positives in there as well, but be sure to always then, at the other side of the sandwich, that piece of bread, end with a positive comment. That will help us know that, you know what, I have a solid foundation of things to continue to build upon going into that next speech. For all comments, try to be as specific as possible. If you think their vocals were good, say, hey, you had good vocals, but let them know more specifically what was it about the vocals that you thought was a success. Be objective. We're here to help each other, of course, but be honest, really. I don't feel like you have to tiptoe around things that they need to do well, because if we avoid that, then we won't improve. And then finally, do be constructive. As I mentioned, give us tips, tricks, advice for how to improve, how to get better on those things for our following speech. So here's your exercise. Now, before you give feedback to your partners, you're going to give feedback to one of the videos I've posted in this module. I want you to click on the self-introduction speech example, Lady with a Gun, and watch it. While you're watching, take notes on the speaker's delivery, vocal and nonverbal, the content, and the structure. Then organize that feedback using the sandwich structure we just reviewed, and send that to your feedback partner, and they'll do the same. That way you can compare notes and discuss.